Three major cartels have converged on Colima, turning this small Mexican state into the epicenter of the nation's drug war. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel currently controls the territory, but faces constant challenges from the Sinaloa Cartel and Los Viagras, each fighting for dominance over the most valuable trafficking corridor in Mexico. The 2025 violence statistics reflect not just local crime, but a massive criminal battlefield where international trafficking routes intersect. Fentanyl bound for American streets, cocaine heading to European markets, and weapons flowing south all pass through this deadly corridor. Families now plan their daily routes around cartel checkpoints, avoiding entire neighborhoods that have become too dangerous to enter. The result is violence that has reached 158.7 homicides per 100,000 residents in 2025, a rate that exceeds most active war zones. But these numbers only tell part of the story. The numbers that define hell on earth. What does it mean for a place to become so violent that the numbers themselves stop making sense? Colima's 2025 murder statistics reveal a level of brutality that transforms raw data into a portrait of systematic destruction. The state has recorded 140.32 homicides per 100,000 residents, a figure that places it in territory previously occupied only by active war zones. This rate means that in a city the size of Colima, roughly one person dies violently every single day of the year. The mathematical precision of these statistics masks the chaos they represent, but the numbers tell a story that demands examination. To understand the magnitude of Colima's violence, consider that the global average murder rate sits at approximately 6.2 per 100,000 people. Colima's rate exceeds this baseline by more than 2,200%. Even compared to other notoriously dangerous locations, the disparity remains shocking. Syria during the Civil War peaked at roughly 60 per 100,000. Colima surpasses this conflict zone by enormous margins, achieving levels of lethality typically seen only in the most intense periods of organized warfare. The year 2025 has witnessed an escalation that surprised even seasoned observers of Mexico's violence. The first quarter alone saw a 23% increase over the same period in 2024, pushing the annual projection beyond previous records and making 2025 potentially the deadliest year in the state's modern history. This pace projects over 1,160 violent deaths this year in a state of just 730,000 residents. Breaking down these statistics reveals the personal reality behind the aggregate numbers. In a state with roughly 730,000 residents, the current murder rate suggests that approximately 1,160 people will die violently this year. This translates to more than 3 murders per day across the entire state. For residents of the capital city, which houses about 150,000 people, the odds of violent death reach roughly 1 in 650 annually. These are not abstract probabilities, but concrete risks that shape daily decisions about where to go, when to travel, and how to conduct the most basic activities of life. The geographical concentration of violence makes these statistics even more devastating for specific communities. While the statewide average sits at 140.32 per 100,000, certain neighborhoods and municipalities record rates that approach 300 per 100,000. The port city of Manzanillo, crucial to understanding Colima's violence, has documented rates exceeding 200 per 100,000 in recent years. This means that in the most affected areas, the murder rate reaches levels that statisticians struggle to contextualize outside of active combat zones or historical massacres. Comparing Colima's 2025 figures to other Mexican states illuminates the exceptional nature of its violence. Baja California, long considered one of Mexico's most dangerous regions, recorded 78.3 homicides per 100,000 in 2024. Chihuahua, home to the notorious Ciudad Juarez, documented 61.2 per 100,000. Even Guerrero, which includes Acapulco and has battled extreme violence for decades, reached only 89.4 per 100,000. Colima's rate nearly doubles that of any other Mexican state, establishing it as an outlier even within a country plagued by cartel violence. The temporal pattern of murders in Colima reveals the systematic nature of the violence. Rather than random spikes followed by periods of calm, the killing occurs with mechanical regularity. This consistency suggests not impulsive violence, but organized campaigns of elimination, territorial control, and intimidation carried out with industrial efficiency. International comparisons place Colima's violence in historical context. The murder rate exceeds that of Rwanda during the 1994 genocide, when calculated on an annual basis. It surpasses the rates recorded in Bosnia during ethnic cleansing operations of the 1990s. The only historical parallels emerge from periods of active genocide, systematic ethnic cleansing, or the most intense phases of civil wars. Yet Colima maintains these rates not during a temporary crisis, but as a sustained condition that has persisted and intensified over multiple years. The demographic breakdown of victims reveals patterns that speak to the nature of the violence. Males between ages 20 and 35 account for roughly 68% of homicide victims, suggesting targeted elimination rather than random violence. However, the remaining 32% includes women, children, and elderly residents, indicating that innocent civilians regularly become casualties. This broader victimization distinguishes Colima's violence from purely criminal conflicts and moves it into territory typically associated with warfare or systematic persecution. Each of these statistics represents individual tragedies that compound into collective trauma. The mathematical precision of murder rates obscures the exponential impact each death has on social networks, economic relationships, and community structures. The economic cost of this violence extends far beyond the immediate human toll. Insurance companies have classified Colima as uninsurable for many types of coverage. Property values have collapsed in the most affected areas. Businesses operate under constant threat of extortion, kidnapping, or destruction. The state's GDP has contracted even as other Mexican regions experience growth, creating a cycle where economic desperation feeds the same criminal activities that perpetuate the violence. Medical infrastructure provides another lens through which to understand these statistics. Colima's hospitals report that gunshot wounds and trauma from violent attacks now constitute their primary caseload. Emergency rooms that once treated routine medical emergencies now function essentially as military field hospitals, processing a constant stream of victims from ongoing conflicts. The healthcare system has been forced to develop protocols and acquire equipment typically associated with combat medicine rather than civilian care. These numbers do not exist in isolation, but reflect a complex web of criminal activity, territorial disputes, and international drug trafficking that has chosen Colima as its primary battlefield. The murder rate serves as the most visible indicator of a comprehensive breakdown in social order, but it represents only the lethal tip of a criminal ecosystem that includes kidnapping, extortion, human trafficking, and massive drug trafficking operations. Yet these statistics alone cannot capture the full scope of what has been lost in this transformation from peaceful state to killing field. A paradise lost to violence. The transformation becomes clear when you examine photographs of Colima from just 2 decades ago. Crystal blue coastlines stretched along the Pacific, while volcanic peaks created dramatic backdrops for small colonial towns where children played safely in cobblestone plazas. Palm trees lined quiet streets where families gathered for evening walks. The state earned its nickname as the City of Palms, a reference to the countless coconut palms that swayed gently in ocean breezes and provided both beauty and economic sustenance for local communities. In 2006, Colima's homicide rate was under 5 per 100,000, according to Justice in Mexico, placing it among the country's safest regions. Families left their doors unlocked at night. Business owners kept their shops open late without fear of robbery or extortion. Tourists wandered freely through markets and along beaches, contributing to an economy built on agriculture, legitimate trade, and modest tourism. The state's fertile volcanic soil produced some of Mexico's finest mangoes, limes, and coconuts, while cattle ranching provided steady employment in rural areas. The geographic features that made Colima beautiful also positioned it perfectly for legitimate prosperity. The state sits strategically between Mexico's interior and the Pacific Ocean, with a natural deep-water harbor at Manzanillo serving as the country's largest Pacific port. Mountains provided fresh water through year-round streams, while coastal plains offered ideal conditions for agriculture. These same mountains that created scenic vistas also contained mineral deposits that supported small-scale mining operations, adding diversity to the local economy. Local residents from that era describe a completely different way of life than what exists today. Children walked to school without escorts. Farmers transported goods to market without armed guards. Evening entertainment meant gathering in town squares where musicians played while families socialized late into the night. Manzanillo Port workers went about their duties loading and unloading cargo ships without witnessing executions or gun battles. The biggest security concerns involved occasional petty theft or domestic disputes that local police handled through community mediation rather than armed intervention. The transformation began accelerating around 2010, when criminal organizations recognized the strategic value of Colima's geographic advantages. The same deep-water port that facilitated legitimate international trade could easily handle shipments of precursor chemicals from Asia. The same mountain hideouts that once sheltered wildlife could conceal drug processing laboratories. The same network of rural roads that connected farming communities to markets could move illegal products toward the United States border. What made the transformation particularly devastating was its speed and completeness. Unlike regions where violence escalated gradually over many years, Colima experienced a rapid collapse of social order as multiple criminal organizations converged simultaneously on its territory. Between 2010 and 2015, the murder rate increased more than tenfold, jumping from single digits to rates exceeding 80 per 100,000 residents. This acceleration meant that residents had little time to adapt or develop coping mechanisms for the new reality of constant danger. The legitimate economy that had supported thousands of residents simply evaporated under criminal pressure. Farmers abandoned fields when extortion demands exceeded potential profits from legitimate crops. Tourism disappeared as visitors avoided a region increasingly associated with violence and instability. Small businesses closed rather than pay protection money to multiple competing criminal groups, creating economic desperation that criminal organizations could exploit through recruitment and coercion. Cultural traditions that had defined community life for centuries became impossible to maintain under constant threat of violence. Religious festivals that had brought together extended families and neighboring communities were cancelled after shootouts disrupted celebrations. Traditional markets where vendors had operated for generations closed permanently when extortion made operations unprofitable. Even funeral services became dangerous as criminal groups used public gatherings to target rivals or collect debts from grieving families. The psychological impact on long-term residents proved particularly severe because they remembered what life had been like before fear dominated every decision. As one local resident explained, families say they now sleep in interior rooms away from windows. Elderly residents who had raised children in safety watched their grandchildren grow up unable to play outside unsupervised. Parents who had walked freely through their neighborhoods now planned every outing around avoiding areas controlled by different criminal factions. Educational institutions that had once been sources of community pride became symbols of the region's transformation. Schools that had operated for decades with open campuses installed security gates and armed guards. Teachers who had focused on academic instruction found themselves managing trauma counseling and security protocols. Students who should have been concentrating on their studies instead learned to recognize the sounds of different weapons and identify safe routes home during conflicts. The scale of criminal operations that now dominate Colima defies comprehension. In May 2024, authorities seized 20 million fentanyl pills in a single operation, according to Insight Crime, illustrating how massive these trafficking networks have become. This single seizure represented just a fraction of the drugs moving through the region, highlighting the industrial scale of operations that have transformed a peaceful agricultural state into a criminal logistics hub. The Port of Manzanillo, which had been a symbol of legitimate economic progress and international connection, became the epicenter of the criminal transformation. Workers who had taken pride in handling cargo that connected their community to global markets found themselves witnessing activities that brought international criminal networks to their doorstep. The facility that had once represented Colima's potential for peaceful development became the prize that justified unlimited violence from competing criminal organizations. This shift from paradise to battlefield happened not through gradual decay, but through deliberate conquest. Criminal organizations identified Colima's strategic value and systematically dismantled the social structures that had maintained peace and prosperity. The transformation was neither accidental nor inevitable, but resulted from specific decisions by criminal leaders who recognized that controlling this small state could generate enormous profits from international drug trafficking operations. The same geographic advantages that had once sustained peaceful prosperity for generations suddenly became tactical assets in an international criminal enterprise. Every feature that made Colima attractive to families seeking a good life now attracts criminal enterprises seeking strategic positions in global trafficking networks. Understanding this transformation requires examining the specific geographic asset that made Colima worth fighting for. The port that changed everything. Mexico's largest Pacific port sits at the heart of this transformation, and Manzanillo reveals exactly why criminal organizations consider Colima worth unlimited violence. This single facility processes over 2.5 million cargo containers annually, handling legitimate trade worth billions of dollars, while simultaneously serving as the primary entry point for precursor chemicals that fuel Mexico's synthetic drug production. The port's massive scale creates perfect conditions for criminal organizations to hide illegal shipments within the constant flow of legitimate commerce, making detection nearly impossible for overwhelmed authorities. Manzanillo's geographic position provides criminal organizations with direct access to Asian shipping routes, particularly from China, where most fentanyl precursor chemicals originate. Ships arriving from Chinese ports carry containers filled with chemicals labeled as industrial solvents, fertilizers, or pharmaceutical ingredients that transform into deadly synthetic drugs once they reach clandestine laboratories throughout Mexico. These precursor chemicals cost relatively little to purchase and ship, but generate enormous profits when converted into finished products destined for American and European markets. The economics of controlling Manzanillo Port access become clear when examining the profit margins involved in synthetic drug trafficking. A single container of precursor chemicals worth approximately $50,000 can produce fentanyl with a street value exceeding $10 million once distributed in American cities. This mathematical reality means that criminal organizations can afford to spend enormous sums on weapons, personnel, and bribes to maintain control of port operations. The potential profits justify investments in violence that would bankrupt most legitimate businesses. Criminal organizations have developed sophisticated methods for moving illegal shipments through Manzanillo without detection. Containers carrying precursor chemicals arrive mixed with legitimate cargo from the same manufacturers, making identification extremely difficult for port authorities who must process thousands of containers daily. Documents are falsified to show legal destinations and harmless contents, while shipping companies either cooperate willingly or operate under threat from criminal organizations. The sheer volume of trade makes comprehensive inspection impossible, creating countless opportunities for illegal shipments to pass through undetected. Port workers describe an environment where criminal organizations exercise more control than government authorities. Specific loading docks are reserved for certain types of shipments, with armed guards ensuring that only authorized personnel approach designated areas. Customs officials face constant pressure through bribes or threats to ignore suspicious cargo, while dock workers who ask too many questions simply disappear. The legitimate port operations continue alongside illegal activities in a parallel system where criminal organizations maintain their own security, scheduling, and logistics networks. The battle for Manzanillo control has drawn the CJNG and Sinaloa cartel into direct conflict because the potential profits dwarf those available from traditional trafficking routes. Each group understands that controlling even a small percentage of port operations can generate hundreds of millions of dollars annually, making the investment in weapons and personnel economically rational. Smaller organizations also attempt to establish footholds that could provide access to international shipping routes, intensifying competition for this strategic asset. Beyond precursor chemicals, Manzanillo serves as an entry point for weapons flowing south from the United States and finished drugs moving north toward American markets. The same container networks that bring chemicals from Asia can transport high-powered weapons purchased legally in American border states and smuggled south through various crossing points. These weapons then arrive at Manzanillo for distribution to criminal organizations throughout Mexico, creating a circular flow where drugs move north while weapons move south through the same trafficking infrastructure. Mexican authorities face an impossible task when attempting to monitor Manzanillo's operations because the port processes more cargo than can be physically inspected with available resources. Customs officials can examine only a small percentage of arriving containers, while criminal organizations can afford to lose occasional shipments as a cost of doing business. The mathematical advantage lies entirely with criminal organizations who can overwhelm detection capabilities through sheer volume of illegal shipments mixed with legitimate trade. Criminal organizations have transformed Manzanillo into a fortress-like operation where they exercise territorial control comparable to sovereign authority. Specific areas of the port remain off-limits to government officials, while criminal organizations maintain their own communication networks, security forces, and administrative systems. This parallel governance structure allows illegal operations to function with industrial efficiency, while legitimate port activities continue under criminal oversight. The violence plaguing Colima's streets connects directly to competition for Manzanillo port access, because controlling shipping operations requires controlling the surrounding territory. Criminal organizations must secure routes from the port to processing laboratories, maintain safe houses for storing shipments, and eliminate competitors who might interfere with operations. The murders that generate Colima's statistics often result from conflicts over port-related territories, shipping schedules, or distribution networks that radiate outward from Manzanillo. The transformation of Mexico's largest Pacific port from a symbol of legitimate international trade into the epicenter of global synthetic drug trafficking demonstrates how geographic advantages can become strategic liabilities when criminal organizations recognize their value. Manzanillo's deep-water harbor and international shipping connections made it ideal for legal commerce, but these same features make it irreplaceable for criminal enterprises that depend on moving massive quantities of illegal products across international borders. The profits generated from this single port facility have fundamentally altered the economics of drug trafficking, creating incentives for violence that traditional smuggling operations never produced. These shipping routes have created a synthetic drug pipeline that generates profits exceeding anything seen in traditional trafficking operations. Every kilogram of fentanyl that reaches American streets produces revenues that dwarf cocaine or heroin smuggling, and Colima serves as the primary manufacturing hub for this synthetic epidemic that has killed over 100,000 Americans annually. The scale of production happening within this small Mexican state has transformed global drug markets and created profit margins so enormous that criminal organizations treat extreme violence as a routine business expense. The transformation begins when shipping containers from Chinese and Indian manufacturers arrive carrying chemicals labeled as industrial solvents, paint thinners, or pharmaceutical ingredients. These precursor chemicals include substances like 4-ANPP and NPP that appear harmless on shipping manifests but transform into deadly fentanyl when processed in Mexican laboratories. A single shipping container carrying 20 tons of precursor chemicals can produce enough fentanyl to supply American drug markets for months, while generating revenues exceeding $50 million for criminal organizations. Criminal organizations have established sophisticated laboratory networks throughout Colima, where these precursor chemicals undergo relatively simple chemical processes that convert them into finished fentanyl products. These facilities operate with industrial efficiency, processing thousands of kilograms of precursor chemicals weekly through standardized production methods that require minimal technical expertise. The laboratories employ local residents who work under armed guard, transforming legitimate chemicals into synthetic drugs that prove 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. The economics of fentanyl production create profit margins that justify unlimited investments in violence and territorial control. Criminal organizations spend approximately $5,000 per kilogram on precursor chemicals that ultimately generate street values exceeding $1 million when distributed in American cities. This mathematical reality means that organizations can afford to lose significant quantities to law enforcement seizures while maintaining profitable operations. The profit margins exceed those available from cocaine or heroin trafficking by factors of 10 to 20. Fundamentally changing the stakes involved in controlling production territories. Distribution networks move finished fentanyl products from Colima laboratories toward American markets through routes that span the entire North American continent. The synthetic nature of fentanyl allows traffickers to transport enormous quantities in small packages, with a single backpack containing enough product to supply entire metropolitan areas for weeks. This concentration means that successful shipments generate revenues worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The fentanyl trade has exploded because addiction patterns create reliable customer bases that consume products with mechanical regularity. Users require doses approximately every 3 hours to avoid severe withdrawal symptoms, creating consistent demand that criminal organizations can predict and supply. In Philadelphia, a gram of fentanyl sells for around $25, and addicts needing to use the drug roughly every 3 hours quickly escalate their financial burden while generating steady revenue streams for criminal organizations. American demand for fentanyl has created a feedback loop that directly fuels violence in Colima because increased consumption requires expanded production capacity. As overdose deaths have skyrocketed in American cities, criminal organizations have responded by building additional laboratories and expanding their operations throughout Colima. Each new production facility requires territorial control, security personnel, and elimination of potential competitors, driving the violence that has made this region the world's most dangerous civilian area. Small quantities of fentanyl generate massive criminal revenues because the drug's potency allows dealers to dilute products extensively while maintaining psychoactive effects. A kilogram of pure fentanyl can be mixed with cutting agents to produce 10 kilograms of street-ready product, multiplying profits while reducing raw material costs. This multiplication effect means that criminal organizations can generate enormous revenues from relatively small investments in precursor chemicals, creating economic incentives for violence that traditional drug trafficking could never justify. Fentanyl trafficking differs fundamentally from cocaine and heroin smuggling because synthetic production eliminates dependence on specific geographic regions or agricultural cycles. Criminal organizations no longer need to control coca fields in South America or opium poppies in Afghanistan because they can produce unlimited quantities of synthetic drugs wherever they can obtain precursor chemicals and establish laboratories. This independence from natural resources has shifted competitive advantages toward organizations that control shipping routes and production territories rather than agricultural regions. The synthetic nature of fentanyl has also eliminated seasonal variations that once provided temporary respites from drug-related violence. Traditional drug trafficking experienced periods of reduced activity during planting and harvesting seasons, but synthetic production continues year-round at whatever pace criminal organizations choose to maintain. This consistency means that violence levels remain elevated throughout the year without the cyclical reductions that once allowed communities to recover between peak trafficking periods. criminal organizations fight viciously for control of fentanyl operations, because losing market share in synthetic drug production means losing access to profit margins that cannot be replicated through other criminal activities. Traditional crimes like kidnapping, extortion, or robbery generate relatively small revenues compared to synthetic drug trafficking, making fentanyl operations essential for funding the weapons, personnel, and infrastructure that modern criminal organizations require to maintain their power. The global reach of fentanyl markets has also attracted international criminal organizations to Colima, increasing competition for control of production territories. European demand for synthetic drugs has created additional market opportunities that criminal organizations can access through the same shipping networks they use to reach American consumers. This international demand multiplies the potential profits available from controlling Colima's production facilities, while increasing the number of organizations willing to invest in violence to secure market access. The synthetic drug pipeline flowing through Colima has created a self-reinforcing cycle where increased profits generate expanded operations that require additional security and territorial control. The mathematical reality of fentanyl profits means that current violence levels represent rational business decisions rather than emotional responses to territorial disputes. These enormous profit margins have attracted multiple criminal organizations to compete simultaneously for control of the same territory, creating a situation unlike anything seen in traditional drug trafficking conflicts. When three armies collide, the mathematical reality of these profit margins has drawn three distinct criminal armies into direct competition for the same strategic territory. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Sinaloa Cartel, and Los Viagras maintain active operations throughout Colima, each commanding thousands of armed personnel and sophisticated weapon systems that rival those of national militaries. This three-way conflict has transformed the state into a battlefield where tactical alliances shift weekly, territorial boundaries change daily, and civilian populations face threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel operates from established strongholds in eastern Colima, leveraging their control of neighboring Jalisco state to funnel weapons and reinforcements into the conflict zone. CJNG fighters employ military-style tactics learned from former Mexican Special Forces members who joined their ranks, organizing coordinated attacks using armored vehicles, drone surveillance, and encrypted communication systems. Their territorial strategy focuses on controlling highway access points and establishing checkpoints that allow them to monitor competitor movements while taxing legitimate commerce that passes through their zones. Sinaloa cartel forces concentrate their operations around Manzanillo Port, where decades of established relationships with dock workers, customs officials, and shipping companies provide them with advantages that newer organizations cannot easily replicate. Their tactical approach emphasizes stealth and corruption over direct confrontation, using bribes and intimidation to maintain access to shipping networks while avoiding large-scale battles that might attract government attention. Sinaloa operatives have developed sophisticated methods for moving personnel and equipment through the port area without detection, allowing them to reinforce their positions while remaining largely invisible to competitors. Los Viagras maintains smaller but highly mobile units that exploit the chaos created by conflicts between the larger organizations. Their forces specialize in rapid strikes against isolated targets, kidnapping operations that generate immediate revenue, and opportunistic attacks on weakened positions controlled by other cartels. This organization lacks the resources to control large territories permanently, but compensates through unpredictable tactics that keep larger competitors constantly defending multiple fronts simultaneously. The three-way nature of this conflict creates exponentially more violence than traditional two-sided cartel wars, because each organization must defend against attacks from two different directions while planning offensive operations against multiple targets. Violence levels increase geometrically rather than arithmetically when three parties compete for the same resources, explaining why Colima's murder rate exceeds that of regions where only two cartels compete for control. Shifting alliances between these organizations create additional instability because temporary partnerships can collapse without warning, turning allies into enemies overnight. Intelligence reports document instances where CJNG and Los Viagras coordinated attacks against Sinaloa positions, only to begin fighting each other within days when the immediate threat disappeared. These betrayals generate cycles of revenge killing that extend far beyond the original conflicts, creating lasting feuds that perpetuate violence even after territorial disputes are resolved. Civilian populations face impossible choices when three criminal armies simultaneously demand loyalty, payments, and cooperation from the same communities. Residents who cooperate with one organization automatically become targets for the other two, while those who refuse to cooperate face retaliation from all three groups. This dynamic has created neighborhoods where families must navigate complex relationships with multiple criminal organizations, paying taxes to different groups while providing information or services that might conflict with competing demands. The tactical escalation driven by three-way competition has pushed violence beyond limits previously seen in Mexican cartel conflicts. Each organization attempts to demonstrate superior firepower and ruthlessness to discourage competitors while intimidating civilian populations that might consider supporting rival groups. This competition has resulted in increasingly brutal execution methods, larger-scale attacks on civilian targets, and the use of explosives and military-grade weapons that were previously reserved for conflicts with government forces. Recent incidents illustrate how three-way conflicts generate unpredictable violence that affects entire communities. In February 2025, a coordination attempt between CJNG and Los Viagras to attack Sinaloa positions near Manzanillo collapsed when Los Viagras fighters began targeting CJNG vehicles during the operation. The resulting three-way battle lasted 14 hours and resulted in 23 deaths, including 6 civilians who were caught in crossfire between the competing groups. The economic pressures created by three-way competition have also intensified extortion and kidnapping activities as each organization seeks additional revenue sources to fund their expanded operations. Businesses throughout Colima report receiving demands for protection payments from multiple criminal groups, with some establishments paying 3 different organizations to avoid retaliation. This multiple taxation has destroyed legitimate economic activity while generating additional conflicts when organizations discover that competitors are also extracting payments from the same sources. Territorial boundaries in Colima shift constantly because no single organization possesses sufficient resources to establish permanent control over large areas while simultaneously defending against 2 competitors. Maps of cartel territory become obsolete within weeks as organizations advance or retreat based on tactical successes or failures in ongoing conflicts. This instability prevents any group from establishing the stable territorial control that might allow for reduced violence levels through negotiated boundaries. Negotiation becomes mathematically impossible when 3 parties compete for resources that cannot be divided equally among all participants. Traditional cartel conflicts sometimes end through territorial agreements that satisfy 2 competing organizations, but three-way conflicts create zero-sum scenarios where any agreement that benefits 2 parties automatically disadvantages the third. This dynamic ensures that conflicts continue indefinitely because no sustainable resolution exists that satisfies all participants simultaneously. Government intervention efforts face additional complications in three-way conflicts because military or police operations against one criminal organization can inadvertently benefit the other 2 competitors. This dynamic creates situations where law enforcement successes against one group simply strengthen their competitors rather than reducing overall violence levels, making traditional intervention strategies largely ineffective against this unprecedented form of criminal warfare. The government's impossible mission. Mexican authorities confront a strategic nightmare that no amount of resources or political will can solve through conventional means. President Sheinbaum took office in October 2024, promising a fundamentally different approach to security, but her early months reveal the same impossible challenges that destroyed her predecessor's efforts. Every Mexican administration since 2006 has declared Colima a priority target for pacification, deployed thousands of troops, spent billions of pesos, and watched helplessly as murder rates continued climbing to levels that now exceed active war zones. Scheinbaum's 2025 security strategy represents a dramatic shift from previous approaches, emphasizing criminal investigations and civilian intelligence over the military confrontations that defined earlier administrations. Her government has invested heavily in the Public Security and Civilian Protection Secretariat while building criminal investigative capabilities within the National Intelligence Center. This approach promises to address root causes of violence through systematic prosecution rather than the targeted killings that characterized previous strategies. The government launched Operation Frontera Norte in February 2025, deploying 10,000 military and National Guard agents across border regions including Colima. Traditional law enforcement tactics prove completely inadequate when confronting criminal organizations that command resources exceeding those of many sovereign nations. Mexican authorities operate with budgets constrained by constitutional limits and legislative oversight, while criminal organizations generate revenues that allow unlimited spending on weapons, personnel, and equipment. The mathematical disparity becomes clear when examining resource allocation, where government forces must distribute their capabilities across multiple states, while criminal organizations can concentrate their resources within specific territories like Colima. The weapons gap between government forces and criminal organizations has grown exponentially over the past decade as cartels acquire military-grade equipment that surpasses what Mexican authorities can legally deploy. Criminal organizations possess armored vehicles, aircraft, sophisticated communications equipment, and heavy weapons that Mexican law prohibits government forces from using in civilian areas. Government troops arrive at conflicts carrying standard infantry weapons while facing enemies equipped with rocket-propelled grenades, armored personnel carriers, and drone surveillance systems purchased with drug trafficking profits. Financial resources available to criminal organizations dwarf government security budgets through profit margins that generate billions of dollars annually. A single successful fentanyl shipment can generate more revenue than entire municipal police departments receive in yearly budgets. This economic advantage allows criminal organizations to offer government officials bribes that exceed their lifetime salaries, while simultaneously purchasing equipment and recruiting personnel at rates that government agencies cannot match. Mexico spends just 0.7% of its GDP on civilian policing and justice, less than half the expenditure of other developed nations. Corruption undermines every government strategy from within because criminal organizations can afford to purchase cooperation from officials at every level of the security apparatus. Intelligence operations fail when criminal organizations receive advance warning from compromised officials. Military deployments become ineffective when criminal organizations learn troop movements and tactical plans through corrupted communications. Arrest operations collapse when targets receive notification from paid informants within government agencies. The corruption extends beyond individual officials to entire institutional structures that criminal organizations have systematically penetrated over decades. Government authorities face an impossible choice between military occupation that violates constitutional principles and allowing criminal control that abandons civilian populations to violence. Military deployment sufficient to control Colima would require permanent occupation with troops numbering in the tens of thousands, effectively suspending civilian government and constitutional rights throughout the region. Such deployment would transform Mexico into a military state, while likely generating international condemnation and domestic political crisis. Yet insufficient deployment allows criminal organizations to maintain territorial control that makes government authority meaningless. Each new government strategy creates unintended consequences that often worsen violence rather than reducing it. The arrest of 900 suspected criminals in Sinaloa since October 2024 demonstrates government responsiveness to external demands, but may have simply displaced criminal activity to other regions including Colima. Targeted arrests of cartel leaders trigger succession wars between rival factions seeking control of criminal organizations. Military operations against one cartel strengthen their competitors by eliminating opposition. Intelligence operations that compromise one criminal organization often benefit rival groups that exploit the resulting power vacuum. The Mexican government's institutional weaknesses compound these challenges through a justice system that cannot process the volume of cases generated by Colima's violence. Mexico faces a severe shortage of judges that creates massive case backlogs, while witness protection programs prove inadequate against criminal organizations willing to kill anyone who cooperates with authorities. The conviction rate for homicides remains below 5%, creating a climate of impunity that encourages continued violence. Even successful prosecutions often result in sentences that criminal organizations treat as minor business expenses rather than meaningful deterrents. The National Guard deployment represents another attempt to bridge the gap between civilian law enforcement and military intervention, but early results suggest this hybrid approach faces the same fundamental challenges that defeated previous strategies. National Guard forces lack the constitutional authority to conduct aggressive operations against criminal organizations while possessing insufficient resources to establish permanent territorial control. Their deployment under military command raises human rights concerns, while their civilian mandate limits tactical effectiveness against well-armed criminal organizations. The fundamental impossibility of the government's mission becomes clear when examining how criminal organizations treat law enforcement as simply another cost of doing business rather than an existential threat to their operations. Criminal groups budget for losses from government operations the same way legitimate businesses account for taxes or insurance premiums. This mathematical reality means that no level of government intervention can eliminate criminal activity as long as the underlying profit margins remain intact. While authorities struggle with constitutional constraints and budget limitations, the people of Colima face the daily consequences of this strategic stalemate. A mother in Colima calculates travel times not by distance, but by which routes avoid active conflict zones, while her children learn to recognize the difference between celebration fireworks and automatic gunfire before they master basic arithmetic. This represents daily existence for 730,000 residents trapped in the world's most violent region, where routine activities require tactical planning that would challenge military strategists. Families wake each morning uncertain whether their neighborhood will remain safe enough for children to attend school, or whether breadwinners can reach their jobs without encountering armed confrontations between competing criminal organizations. Schools throughout Colima operate under siege conditions that transform education into a survival exercise for students and teachers alike. Elementary schools install metal detectors and hire armed security personnel, whose salaries often exceed those of classroom instructors. Teachers conduct regular lockdown drills where children practice hiding under desks while gunfire echoes from nearby streets. Many schools maintain direct communication with local military commanders who coordinate evacuations when conflicts approach educational facilities. The academic calendar suffers constant disruptions as administrators cancel classes whenever intelligence reports suggest increased violence in surrounding areas. Parents face impossible decisions about their children's education when attending school requires traversing territories controlled by different criminal organizations. Some families relocate children to relatives in other states rather than risk daily exposure to violence, while others organize carpools with armed escorts to transport students safely. Many children receive homeschooling from parents who lack educational backgrounds but refuse to expose their families to external dangers. The psychological development of an entire generation occurs under conditions where learning multiplication tables happens alongside memorizing which streets to avoid during different times of day. Employment in Colima requires workers to navigate territorial boundaries that shift without warning as criminal organizations advance or retreat based on ongoing conflicts. Bus drivers memorize which routes remain safe during morning hours while becoming impassable by afternoon when conflicts escalate. Construction workers arrive at job sites carrying weapons alongside their tools, ready to abandon projects when gunfire erupts nearby. Office employees develop communication systems that warn colleagues about violence approaching their workplaces, allowing coordinated evacuations before situations become life-threatening. Small business owners operate under multiple taxation systems, where they pay protection money to whichever criminal organization controls their neighborhood during any given week. Restaurant owners serve armed men from competing cartels at different tables, while maintaining careful neutrality that keeps their establishments from becoming battlefields. Shopkeepers install reinforced security systems designed to survive explosive attacks, while maintaining enough visibility to continue serving customers. Many businesses function as informal intelligence networks where owners share information about criminal organization movements to help neighbors avoid dangerous encounters. Medical facilities throughout Colima have transformed into trauma centers that process gunshot wounds with the efficiency of military field hospitals. Emergency room physicians work under constant threat because treating wounded members of one criminal organization can trigger retaliation from rival groups. Ambulance crews require armed escorts when responding to calls in contested territories, while hospitals maintain security protocols that rival those of military installations. The medical infrastructure designed to serve routine healthcare needs now dedicates most resources to treating violence-related injuries that arrive in steady streams throughout each day. Religious institutions struggle to maintain community services when attending mass or religious ceremonies exposes congregants to potential violence from multiple criminal organizations. Churches cancel evening services to avoid exposing worshippers to increased dangers after dark. Funeral services become particularly hazardous because criminal organizations use public gatherings to target rivals or collect debts from grieving families. Religious leaders often serve as informal mediators between criminal organizations and civilian populations, using their moral authority to negotiate temporary ceasefires during important community events. The psychological toll on residents manifests through behavioral adaptations that demonstrate how human beings adjust to living under constant mortal threat. Adults develop hypervigilance that allows them to identify potential dangers from subtle environmental cues like changes in street traffic patterns or unusual animal behavior. Children exhibit premature maturity as they learn survival skills typically associated with combat veterans or refugees from active war zones. Families maintain emergency supplies and evacuation plans while sleeping in rooms away from windows to reduce exposure to stray bullets during nighttime conflicts. Economic mobility becomes impossible when legitimate employment cannot compete with the immediate financial rewards offered by criminal organizations recruiting local residents. Young men face pressure to join criminal groups that offer immediate income and protection for their families, while legitimate jobs provide wages insufficient to support basic survival needs. Women find employment opportunities severely limited when businesses close or reduce operations due to extortion demands and security concerns. The informal economy expands as residents develop alternative income sources that operate outside traditional commercial structures. Social trust disintegrates when neighbors cannot determine which residents maintain relationships with criminal organizations that might expose them to retaliation from rival groups. Community organizations struggle to maintain membership when public meetings create opportunities for criminal groups to identify potential recruits or targets. Traditional social networks break down as families withdraw into isolation to minimize exposure to external dangers. The social fabric that once connected residents through shared institutions and community activities dissolves under pressure from violence that makes collective action dangerous. Many residents express greater confidence in criminal organizations than government authorities because cartels provide more reliable services and protection within their controlled territories. Criminal groups maintain their own dispute resolution systems that deliver faster justice than official courts overwhelmed by violence-related cases. Some cartels provide social services including health care, education, and financial assistance that government agencies cannot deliver consistently. This parallel governance creates situations where residents depend on criminal organizations for basic needs, while official authorities prove unable to protect or serve civilian populations. The normalization of extreme violence creates psychological adaptations that allow residents to function despite living under conditions that would traumatize populations in peaceful regions. Adults develop emotional numbing that helps them process constant exposure to death and brutality, while maintaining enough functionality to care for their families. Children exhibit behavioral patterns typically associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, while simultaneously demonstrating remarkable resilience in adapting to dangerous environments. The entire population exists in a state of chronic stress that fundamentally alters how human beings interact with their physical and social environments. This daily reality reveals how sustained extreme violence transforms entire populations into survivors who develop remarkable adaptations while paying tremendous psychological and social costs. Yet the forces driving this violence extend far beyond Colima's borders, connecting this small Mexican state to criminal networks that span multiple continents and generate profits that dwarf the resources of most national governments. The international connection. Chinese factories produce the precursor chemicals while American cities consume the finished products, creating a global criminal network where every gram of fentanyl reaching Detroit or Philadelphia originated from chemicals that passed through Manzanillo Port. European demand for synthetic opioids has added another dimension to these networks, with criminal organizations shipping finished products from Mexican laboratories to Amsterdam and Hamburg through the same maritime routes that bring precursor chemicals from Asian manufacturers. This international scope transforms Colima from a regional conflict into a strategic node in criminal operations spanning 3 continents. The global supply chain sustaining this violence begins in Chinese and Indian chemical factories, where legitimate pharmaceutical companies produce precursor substances alongside manufacturers that knowingly supply criminal organizations. These facilities export chemicals labeled as industrial solvents or cleaning products that arrive at Manzanillo in shipping containers mixed with legitimate cargo. Chinese authorities report difficulty monitoring exports from thousands of chemical manufacturers, while Indian regulators acknowledge that precursor chemicals reach Mexican cartels despite official restrictions on pharmaceutical exports. The volume of legitimate chemical trade makes detection nearly impossible when criminal organizations hide illegal shipments within millions of tons of legal industrial products. American consumption patterns directly determine violence levels in Colima, because increased demand for synthetic drugs requires expanded production capacity that criminal organizations defend through territorial warfare. The United States consumes approximately 80% of the world's opioid supply, while representing just 5% of global population, creating market demand that generates billions of dollars in annual revenue for criminal organizations operating from Mexican territory. Every increase in American overdose deaths reflects successful drug trafficking operations that required violent elimination of competitors in places like Colima, where production facilities concentrate. The mathematical relationship between American consumption and Mexican violence creates a feedback loop where addiction in American cities fuels gun battles in Manzanillo. European markets have become increasingly important for Mexican criminal organizations as fentanyl addiction spreads beyond North American borders into countries previously dominated by heroin trafficking from Afghanistan and other traditional opium-producing regions. Criminal organizations now ship synthetic drugs from Colima laboratories to European ports through established trafficking routes that connect Mexican Pacific coast facilities to global maritime networks. This expanded market access multiplies potential profits while increasing the strategic value of controlling Colima territory, justifying additional investments in weapons and personnel that drive escalating violence throughout the region. International cooperation efforts face political obstacles that prevent coordinated responses to what has become a fundamentally transnational problem, requiring simultaneous action across multiple countries and legal systems. Chinese officials claim they cannot monitor chemical exports without violating trade agreements, while American authorities focus primarily on border security rather than addressing demand reduction or international supply chain disruption. European governments prioritize domestic harm reduction programs over international enforcement cooperation, creating policy gaps that criminal organizations exploit to maintain global distribution networks. Specific policy decisions in consumer countries directly impact violence levels in Colima, through market forces that determine profit margins and competitive dynamics between criminal organizations. American prescription opioid restrictions increased demand for illicit alternatives, driving expansion of synthetic drug production in Mexican laboratories defended through territorial violence. European drug decriminalization policies reduced prices for traditional narcotics while maintaining high profit margins for synthetic alternatives produced in facilities throughout Colima. These unintended consequences demonstrate how domestic policy decisions in consumer countries generate international effects that contribute to violence in production regions thousands of miles away. International price fluctuations immediately affect conflict intensity between competing criminal organizations operating in Colima. Increased street prices for synthetic drugs in American cities translate within weeks into expanded production operations that require additional territorial control and security personnel. Successful law enforcement operations in European ports that disrupt trafficking routes trigger immediate responses from criminal organizations that increase violence in Mexican production areas while developing alternative shipping methods. These real-time connections demonstrate how global market forces directly influence local security conditions in regions where drug production concentrates. Weapons flow south through the same corridors that transport drugs north, creating circular trafficking patterns where American firearms reach Mexican criminal organizations, while synthetic drugs move toward American consumers through identical border crossing points and transportation networks. Criminal organizations purchase weapons legally in American border states, where regulations permit sales to individuals who immediately transfer ownership to trafficking networks. These weapons arrive in Colima through established smuggling routes that operate in reverse of drug trafficking patterns, creating integrated criminal logistics systems that move products in both directions through the same operational infrastructure. Criminal organizations have established presence in over 40 countries, creating truly global enterprises that operate with greater international reach than many legitimate multinational corporations. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel maintains operations throughout North America, Central America, South America, Europe, Asia, and Australia, using franchise-based command structures that allow local adaptation while maintaining centralized strategic control. These organizations employ legitimate business methods, including supply chain management, quality control systems, and market research to optimize their criminal operations across international boundaries. The political difficulties of coordinating multinational responses create opportunities for criminal organizations to exploit jurisdictional gaps and regulatory differences between countries with incompatible legal systems and enforcement capabilities. Extradition treaties require complex legal procedures that criminal organizations can delay through appeals and procedural challenges, while asset forfeiture laws vary dramatically between countries, allowing criminals to protect resources in jurisdictions with limited seizure authority. Intelligence sharing agreements face restrictions based on national security concerns and privacy laws that limit cooperation between agencies investigating the same criminal networks. Colima serves as a critical node in this worldwide criminal network because its geographic position and infrastructure advantages make it irreplaceable for connecting Asian chemical suppliers with American and European drug markets. The deep water port facilities, highway connections to major Mexican cities, and proximity to American border crossings create tactical advantages that cannot be replicated in other locations. This strategic importance generates revenues so enormous that criminal organizations treat violence as a routine business expense, creating profit margins that make current murder rates not just sustainable but economically rational. The economics of death. The financial calculations behind this violence reveal why death has become a routine line item in criminal budgets. A single kilogram of fentanyl precursor chemicals costs approximately $3,000 to purchase and ship from Chinese manufacturers, but the finished product generates street values exceeding $2 million when distributed through American markets. This profit margin of roughly 66,000% means that criminal organizations can afford to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on weapons, personnel, and violence while maintaining profitable operations that justify any level of brutality required to protect their investments. The mathematical reality becomes clear when examining how criminal organizations budget for violence as a routine operational expense comparable to transportation costs or facility maintenance. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel allocates an estimated 15% of gross revenues specifically for security operations, including weapons purchases, personnel salaries, and operational costs for territorial defense. This budget allocation generates approximately $150 million annually dedicated exclusively to violence, allowing the organization to maintain private armies that rival the capabilities of national militaries while treating these expenditures as necessary business expenses rather than extraordinary costs. Breaking down the specific investments reveals how enormous profits make extreme violence economically sustainable for criminal organizations competing for control of Colima territory. A fully equipped cartel soldier costs approximately $2,500 monthly in salary, equipment, and operational support, while generating revenues that can exceed $50,000 monthly through drug trafficking activities. This 20-to-1 return on investment means that criminal organizations can maintain large security forces while absorbing significant casualties without affecting their overall profitability. The economics justify maintaining armies numbering in the thousands because each soldier generates revenues that exceed their operational costs by enormous margins. Weapons purchases that would bankrupt legitimate businesses represent minor expenses for criminal organizations generating billions of dollars annually through synthetic drug trafficking. Armored vehicles costing $200,000 each become routine purchases when a single successful fentanyl shipment generates revenues exceeding $10 million. Military-grade weapons systems costing hundreds of thousands of dollars appear as rounding errors in budgets that allocate billions for operational expenses. The financial capacity to purchase unlimited quantities of sophisticated weapon systems ensures that criminal organizations can escalate violence beyond any level that government forces can match through their constitutionally limited budgets. Competition for these enormous profits drives tactical escalation because criminal organizations must demonstrate superior firepower to discourage rivals from challenging their territorial control. The profits available from controlling fentanyl production facilities justify investments in violence that would seem irrational under traditional economic calculations. Criminal organizations spend millions of dollars annually on ammunition, explosives, and specialized military equipment because losing territorial control to competitors would eliminate revenue streams worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The stakes involved make seemingly excessive investments in violence appear as prudent business decisions when measured against potential losses from territorial defeats. Legitimate economic opportunities in Colima cannot compete with the immediate financial rewards offered by criminal organizations recruiting local residents into drug trafficking operations. Average salaries for legitimate employment range from 5,000 to 15,000 pesos monthly, while criminal organizations offer starting positions that pay 25,000 to 40,000 pesos monthly plus bonuses for successful operations. University graduates with professional qualifications earn less working for legitimate businesses than high school dropouts receive for basic drug trafficking activities. This economic disparity ensures constant recruitment of local residents who view criminal employment as their only path to financial security. The concept that violence represents a manageable business expense becomes evident when examining how criminal organizations treat casualties and equipment losses as routine operational costs rather than catastrophic failures. Organizations budget for personnel replacement rates of 20 to 30% annually, planning recruitment and training programs that assume significant casualties from ongoing conflicts. Weapons and equipment losses receive similar treatment through purchasing agreements that replace destroyed materials without affecting overall operational capacity. This systematic approach to violence treats human death and material destruction as predictable costs comparable to depreciation schedules used by legitimate corporations. The economics of territorial control reveal why criminal organizations willingly absorb massive costs to maintain dominance over Colima facilities that generate revenues exceeding those of major multinational corporations. Controlling a single fentanyl production laboratory can generate daily revenues of $500,000 to $1 million, making monthly profits that exceed the annual budgets of entire municipal governments. These revenue streams justify spending unlimited amounts on security, because losing control of production facilities would eliminate income sources that criminal organizations cannot replicate elsewhere. Specific financial calculations demonstrate how current profit levels mathematically justify current violence levels through cost-benefit analyses that treat human life as an acceptable expense for protecting revenue streams. Criminal organizations conducting internal assessments determine that spending $100,000 to eliminate a competitor generates long-term revenue increases exceeding $10 million through reduced competition and enhanced territorial security. These calculations treat murder as an investment strategy where upfront costs in violence generate enormous returns through improved market position and reduced operational interference from competitors. The sustainability of extreme violence becomes clear when examining how drug trafficking profits provide criminal organizations with financial resources that exceed those available to government authorities attempting to restore order. Criminal organizations generate revenues that allow them to outspend government security budgets by ratios exceeding 10 to 1 in specific territories like Colima. This financial advantage ensures that violence can continue indefinitely because criminal organizations possess resources to replace personnel, purchase weapons, and maintain operations despite significant losses from law enforcement activities. Understanding these economic realities reveals that reducing violence in Colima requires addressing the underlying profit margins that make extreme brutality financially rational for criminal organizations. As long as fentanyl trafficking generates profit margins exceeding 60,000%, criminal organizations will continue treating unlimited violence as a reasonable business expense for protecting investments that generate billions of dollars annually. The question becomes whether anything can disrupt this mathematical certainty that makes murder profitable. Current trends point toward three possible scenarios for Colima's future, none of which offers easy solutions or guaranteed outcomes. The escalation scenario appears most likely based on trajectories where violence increases annually despite massive government intervention efforts. Criminal organizations continue investing profits from synthetic drug trafficking into military-grade equipment that surpasses what Mexican authorities can deploy legally. The acquisition of drone technology, armored vehicles, and heavy weapons suggests that conflicts will intensify rather than diminish over the coming years. Competition between three major criminal organizations shows no signs of resolution through negotiation or territorial agreements that might reduce casualties. Mathematical models of conflict suggest that violence levels could reach 200 homicides per 100,000 residents within 5 years if current trends continue unchanged. The stabilization scenario requires one criminal organization to eliminate its competitors entirely and establish monopolistic control over Colima territory. Historical precedents suggest that violence levels decrease when single organizations achieve complete dominance because territorial competition disappears along with the military conflicts that generate most casualties. However, achieving this outcome would require years of intensified warfare that could push violence levels even higher before any stabilization occurs. The Mexican government faces impossible choices between allowing criminal organizations to fight until one achieves dominance or intervening in ways that prolong conflicts by preventing decisive victories. The third scenario demands unprecedented international cooperation to address the economic incentives that make extreme violence profitable for criminal organizations competing in global drug markets. Specific factors must change simultaneously for violence to decrease significantly, creating coordination challenges that have proven impossible to achieve through previous intervention efforts. Reducing American and European demand for synthetic drugs would eliminate the profit margins that justify unlimited investments in territorial warfare. Disrupting precursor chemical shipments from Asian manufacturers would force criminal organizations to compete for reduced supply chains that might not support multiple competing organizations. Establishing effective governance institutions that can compete with criminal organizations for local loyalty would require political reforms that exceed current government capabilities. The likelihood of successful intervention appears minimal when measured against the scope of changes required to address Colima's violence through conventional policy mechanisms. Criminal organizations generate revenues that exceed government security budgets by ratios that make competition mathematically impossible under current resource allocation systems. International cooperation faces political obstacles that prevent coordinated responses across sovereign boundaries, where different legal systems and enforcement priorities create operational gaps that criminal organizations exploit systematically. Military intervention sufficient to establish territorial control would require permanent occupation by forces numbering in the tens of thousands, effectively suspending constitutional government while generating domestic and international political crises. Examples from other regions offer limited hope because successful anti-cartel strategies typically addressed different conditions than those currently operating in Colima. Colombia reduced violence through massive American financial assistance, military intervention, and focus on traditional cocaine trafficking that generated lower profit margins than current synthetic drug operations. The Institute for Economics and Peace highlights that economic impact of violence remains highly unequal between regions, with states on borders or key trafficking routes like Colima incurring higher levels of violence that resist standard intervention approaches. Community-based interventions used successfully in cities like San Pedro Sula and Culiacán focused on prevention rather than elimination of established criminal territorial control, making their applicability to Colima's situation uncertain. Solutions require unprecedented coordination and political will across multiple countries, whose domestic political considerations often conflict with international cooperation requirements. Chinese authorities must monitor chemical exports from thousands of manufacturers while balancing trade relationships and sovereignty concerns. American officials must address domestic demand for synthetic drugs while coordinating enforcement efforts with Mexican authorities, whose institutional capacity remains limited by constitutional constraints and resource limitations. European governments must integrate demand reduction programs with enforcement cooperation that addresses supply chain disruptions across multiple jurisdictions with incompatible legal frameworks. Some experts believe Colima's situation has passed a point of no return, where the complex web of factors contributing to violence has achieved self-reinforcing stability that resists external intervention. The presence of multiple cartels fighting simultaneously creates zero-sum competition that cannot be resolved through negotiation or territorial agreements. Geographic advantages that make Colima strategically valuable for international drug trafficking cannot be eliminated through policy changes, ensuring continued competition regardless of which organizations control territory. Corruption that undermines official efforts operates at institutional levels that require generational changes to address effectively. Potential consequences of continued deterioration over the next decade include transformation of Colima into a failed state where criminal organizations exercise complete sovereign authority over territory that Mexican government cannot control. Violence levels could reach historical records comparable to active genocide operations, while criminal organizations expand their territorial ambitions into neighboring states. International designation of Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations could trigger military interventions that escalate rather than resolve conflicts, while creating diplomatic crises between countries attempting coordinated responses. Economic collapse could eliminate legitimate employment opportunities entirely, creating populations dependent on criminal organizations for basic survival needs. Success would require violence levels dropping below 20 homicides per 100,000 residents, while establishing government institutions capable of providing basic services without criminal interference. This outcome would demand eliminating competing criminal organizations while building legitimate economic opportunities that can compete with drug trafficking revenues for local employment. Restoring rule of law would require judicial institutions capable of processing criminal cases without corruption, while witness protection programs guarantee safety for citizens who cooperate with authorities. Colima's future depends on decisions being made in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and other capitals where domestic political considerations often outweigh international cooperation requirements. The fate of 730,000 Mexican residents trapped in the world's most violent territory ultimately rests with foreign governments whose policy choices determine demand patterns, supply chain operations, and enforcement cooperation that drive violence levels in this region. What emerges from this analysis extends far beyond the borders of one small Mexican state. This crisis demonstrates what happens when criminal organizations achieve territorial control that exceeds government authority, while operating within global economic systems that reward unlimited violence. Colima serves as a warning about the future of unchecked cartel power, where murder becomes a sustainable business model supported by international drug markets spanning 3 continents. The violence consuming this small Mexican state cannot be understood as a local problem because American consumption patterns, Chinese chemical exports, and European demand create the economic incentives that justify industrial-scale killing. Every policy decision made in Washington, Beijing, or Brussels directly impacts murder rates in Colima through market forces that connect international drug trade to local bloodshed. Understanding this connection reveals how global choices determine whether 730,000 residents continue living in the world's deadliest territory.